affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan. The India-US 2+2 dialogue comprising the defense and foreign ministers of India and the US concluded yesterday in Washington, D.C. And it was interesting to see the kind of reactions and comments we're getting from all our viewers. I have with me Mr. Arun K. Singh. He was India's ambassador to the US and brings a broad perspective on developments there. He's been following developments there closely. Ambassador, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Surya. Good to be with you.
So, as expected, Ukraine cast a long shadow over the 2+2 deliberations. Do you expect that as we go forward into the Quad summit next month, the entire Ukraine pressure will mount on India?
So I don't think so. And in fact, I wouldn't even say the way the meetings were conducted yesterday, that Ukraine really cast a shadow. Of course, the issue came up for discussion. It was there. Maybe the elephant in the room or something people had to discuss. But there were several things that struck me. First, the fact of the meeting being held at this time. 2+2 is a very important format with the foreign and defense ministers of both the countries coming together to meet simultaneously. And India doesn't have this format with too many countries in the world. And for the US also, this is a restricted number of countries with which they follow it. Also, the tradition has been that in the context of the 2+2 meeting, the four ministers jointly call on either the President of the US or the Prime Minister of India, depending on where the meeting is being held. Now, in this case, President Biden decided to also convene a summit meeting with the Indian Prime Minister while the four ministers were meeting. Now, this is something new. This has never happened before. And I think there was a deliberate signal by both countries, and particularly the US, that they are not going to allow the differences there are on the issues related to Ukraine or Russia to come in the way of the broader bilateral relationship, or to continue to work together where there are convergences. So I think if you, for example, looked at the comments that the US Secretary of State made in the joint press conference with the other ministers, where he was asked a question about India's long-standing relationship with Russia. And he said that it's a well-established relationship, long-standing relationship, and it developed at a time when the US was not able to be such a partner.
Yeah.
And so acknowledging that, and therefore saying that US understands India's compulsion. And I think the second effort that I noticed that is being made by the US is to try and reassure India that we are now ready to be that kind of a partner, that we are now willing to be much more forthcoming in terms of defense and other cooperation. Secretary Austin spoke about India being a net security provider in the region. They spoke about working with India for co-development of technology, co-production, and doing more together, not just in terms of military exercises or building the capabilities of the armed forces, but also in terms of industrial production. So all this is something new. And I think they're trying to signal that, look, we are ready to be there as reliable partners, much more than we were in the past. Now, I think it is now for the Indian leadership to figure out whether they can have that kind of confidence in the relationship. Because in the past, at times, US has been very supportive of India. It was the most supportive when we had the 1962 conflict with China. It was supportive when we had issues along the line of actual control in 2020. It did the civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India, which ended really the nuclear apartheid for India. And India could access uranium, nuclear technologies from all over the world. And no other country in the world could have arranged that. But on other occasions, in terms of Pakistan in the 50s, 60s, 80s, or the sanctions that they imposed on India following the nuclear test we had done in 1974, 1998, US had not been so supportive. And I think the Indian leadership will need to assess, based on what the US is today saying or signaling, whether they see a longer term convergence developing and they can have greater confidence in the relationship. But that having been said, Surya, I think in any case, no Indian leader or government would want to put all their eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
You need to have alternatives. Because
Yeah.
if you go entirely, let's say, with the US or its Western partners, but tomorrow their objectives, strategies, goals change, and it doesn't harmonize with what India may want, India will need alternatives at that time. So there is a need to hedge. So I think the challenge for India, which also came through in this meeting, is how do you continue building a stronger partnership with the US, with Europe, which you need to do, because that's where you have your economic interests. Together, they account for 50% of the global GDP. Your largest trading partner is the US. Largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora is the US. Is the largest single country presence of Indians in foreign universities. But while doing that, how do you preserve the relationship with Russia, where also you may have some differences? And if you look at the statements that's coming out from India, while we have not criticized Russia, clearly we are not very comfortable with what Russia has done. We are talking about sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries, which has been violated in Ukraine. We are talking of peace, end to war, and clearly ending war, one can argue, is really in Russia's hands, because they are the ones who started the conflict at this time. So while not criticizing Russia, again, given the nature of our interests, comments have been made which have shown clearly that India is not very comfortable with what Russia has done.
So when I was going through the reports about the 2+2, there's this reference to the rules-based order, which we're used to seeing in the context of the Indo-Pacific. Do you see now a linkage between that and what is happening in Europe? Are the
So
Americans trying
very,
to draw a new link now?
very interestingly, so far, the Americans were looking at the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater as two separate theaters. And you'll recall that in 2012-13, in the Obama administration, and which is now being talked of as the Obama-Biden administration, to show continuity between that administration and the Biden presidency. At that time, they had started talking about pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia. And the argument was that the European security structure had broadly stabilized. The main challenge for the US was going to be the Asia Pacific. It was China that was emerging as the main economic and technological challenge, and that's where the US needed to focus attention and resources. But even that pivot and rebalance, they were not able to carry out, because in 2014, there was a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, where Russia moved in to take over Crimea, and certain parts of territory of Ukraine in Donbass came into the hands of the people that Ukrainians described as separatists. So with that happening, again, the Americans needed to focus some attention. There was also continued instability in West Asia. So because of this, they couldn't carry it on. Under the Trump administration, the strategy focused much more on the challenges in the Asia Pacific. And they renamed the Asia Pacific Command in Hawaii as the Indo-Pacific Command to signal the importance they attach to India as part of their overall strategy in this region. This part started talking of the whole Indo-Pacific region. So they put a lot of emphasis on this challenge. Now, what has happened since February 24 in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict? A lot of people are raising issues of whether this new focus on Europe, will the Obama administration continue to give focus to meet the challenge they are getting from China? I think the signaling now they are doing is that they see challenges in both theaters, and that there are similarities in the challenges in these theaters, and they will need to address both. You may have noticed that about a week ago, there was a NATO ministerial meeting of the foreign ministers, where for the first time among the invitees were the foreign ministers of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, who are allies of the US, treaty allies of the US in the Asia Pacific region. So I think there is sort of an absorption in terms of US strategy, that they need to look at the synergies in the two regions, address the challenges in both the regions. In fact, some commentators have been saying that perhaps for the US, what is evolving in terms of growing Russian engagement with China, and you saw the statement that was issued after the February 4 meeting between President Putin and Chinese President Xi, where they spoke of a partnership without limits, that the US may be facing a broader Eurasian challenge and not just a European challenge or an Asia Pacific challenge. So I think they're trying to work out their strategies. It's a bit of in a flux. Even the NATO has said that they will come out with an Agenda 2030, where there will be some recognition of the fact that NATO is also facing challenges from China, because China had reached Europe. China has taken on leased ports in Europe. Earlier, it was reaching Europe through the Arctic. It was reaching Europe through Russia by train connectivity. That is, of course, disrupted at the moment. So I think this thinking is at the moment in a bit of flux, and we have to see how the strategies congeal in the period ahead.
Somehow our defense ties with the US, they've been talked about. We've been doing a lot of toing and froing, but they haven't really come up with anything substantial. Why is this so? Is it because the defense sector there is primarily in private hands?
Surya, in many ways, defense ties have come up, and in some ways they haven't. And that's, I think, what you're alluding to. Where they have come up is, for example, what India has been buying from the US. Till about 2008, when India and the US did the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, India had hardly bought any defense supplies from the US. Between then and now, we have contracted to buy $20 billion worth of defense supplies. And some of the platforms we have got from the US have been very useful for us. C-17, C-130, P-8I, maritime reconnaissance aircraft. And we use C-17, C-130, for example, when we needed to move large amount of material and forces along the LOC at short notice in 2020. Also, when we had to evacuate Indians from different countries when there was a crisis there. Some of them were used also to evacuate Indians who were coming out of Ukraine. So many of those platforms have been useful. If you look at the kind of military exercises we are doing, bilateral exercises, tri-service exercises, special forces exercises, and the multilateral Malabar exercises, they are growing in complexity. And again, if you look at some of the statements that were made by the ministers in the press conference after the 2+2, talking about willingness to cooperate in defense across all domains. And now they've said that they're also going to have a defense space dialogue. They're going to have a defense dialogue related to artificial intelligence. Where we have not had successes is in terms of co-development of technology. And there was a mechanism called the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, looked at some projects, but there have been no major breakthroughs. So I think there they need to put some focus. Again, where we've not had too much success is in terms of US companies coming to India to do major defense production in India. And so there, as you mentioned, these are private companies, and some of them have argued that they can relocate to India only once they get a major order for which they need to do production in India. So we have to see that going ahead in terms of the strategic partnership model that India has talked about, doing production in India in collaboration with the private sector, whether that leads to something substantive. But another thing that has emerged is that India and the US did an agreement called the Industrial Security Annex, which provides for security in the area of defense production and technology, when our companies have a partnership with US companies. Under that, there is now production happening in India, which is being supplied to major US defense manufacturers as part of global supply chains. So that has started, and we can expect that to pick up in the coming period.
In fact, you mentioned DTTI. There's even a question from Jaydeep Gadhavi on why the DTTI hasn't picked up. But you did mention that. Does the fact that it's a private thing also create issues between the US government, having to go and tell the private guys that, go and build in India when these decisions are normally commercially driven?
Yeah, so I think I found that it's a complex issue because what happens sometimes when the US private sector is willing to come forward and participate, the US government stops them, saying that this is really high level technology and therefore you can't really start producing or doing co-development elsewhere. Now that was in the past. Are they going to look at India differently now? We have to see. Then at other times, what happens is that the US government says that, okay, you can go ahead and do this co-development in India or with Indian partner. And the private company says it is not in their commercial interest to do that. So there are two interests, separate interests involved. And only when they converge will a project be successful. But I think sense I get is that both governments are determined to try and take this forward. When the Indian Prime Minister had gone to the US in September last year, in the joint statement, there is a reference that under DTTI, do some joint development related to air-launched unmanned aerial vehicles. So they're working on that. And again, I saw in the statement, joint statement they came out today, they have talked about some other systems that they will try and get involved in co-development. So there is a willingness, but I think they need to square this circle to ensure that both the government and the private sector in the US are on the same page on any particular project.
I want to come to this issue of the US and France when they tell us or when they give an indication that they could be our new backers in the UN Security Council. Is it something we accept or we are mulling over, we are not comfortable with? What is the thing over here? Because one of the reasons for the close ties with the US, with Russia, is the fact that they back us in the Security Council.
So there are several reasons for the close ties with Russia. One, of course, the fact that earlier the Soviet Union, later Russia, was seen as supportive of India's interests in the UN Security Council whenever issues related to India were brought up there. Then, of course, you have the defense cooperation. We also have an energy partnership with Russia. We've invested quite a bit in Sakhalin-1, and that project has been very, very successful. So these are among the reasons why the relationship with Russia is seen as one where there is a certain level of confidence. But in the recent past, as our relationship with the US and France have deepened, they have also become more and more supportive of India, including the UN Security Council. For example, in August 2019, when we had taken action related to Article 370, China had tried to raise the issue in the UN Security Council. And at that time, it was France that had taken the lead to block China, and they had been supported by the US and Russia. So yes, I think some of our Western partners are now showing a greater willingness to be supportive of India's interests in the international context, including in the UN Security Council. But this is an area where it is only with time and repeated instances and examples that a level of confidence can be built up.
Do you think it's odd, Ambassador, that with the US and with Europe, we have huge trade and commercial interests? You mentioned the diaspora also. Comparatively with Russia, your trade is abysmal, about $7 or $8 billion, and largely confined to oil, gas, weapons. Yet there is this, there seems to be some deep attachment to the Russia connection.
So I think there is a deep attachment to the Russia connection because there is a memory that historically the Soviet Union and Russia were supportive of India. And you may recall that way back in 1955, when India was a lot of pressure, including from US, UK and others, on the issue of Jammu and Kashmir, the Soviet leaders at that time visited India and went to Srinagar, and there in Srinagar publicly said that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. So support like that has been, I think, has impacted in terms of policy and public opinion in India. But beyond that, in terms of defense technology, from time to time, we have got from Russia what has not been available elsewhere. And if you look at, for example, the nuclear propulsion for some of our submarines, there was a partnership with Russia. And that has not been the only instance. So there is a recognition on the Indian side that at times technologies that we needed in defense, they were available only with Russia. And so that's something you need to factor in. And I think Secretary Blinken himself acknowledged that today when he said that in the past, US was not able to be that kind of a partner. So, in terms of high-level technologies, including in defense, what is the level of US willingness to partner? We have to see. Now, they have moved step by step. In 2016, US declared India a major defense partner in the final year of Obama administration. Then the Trump administration put India on STA 1, Strategic Trade Authorization Level 1, which is meant for technology releases at the same level as the closest allies and partners. And I think if you look at the statement coming out of this 2+2 ministerial meeting, again the signal that we are willing to partner with India across all domains and high-end technologies. But it can really be tested only in reality. And as that happens more and more, clearly different stakeholders in India will have an even greater confidence in the US relationship. But that needs some more trying to be proven on the ground.
So we have a question from Dinesh Kumar. Do you think India's future vision is not yet clear regarding where we want to see ourselves? Because we are struggling to criticize Russia, trying to uphold democratic values. We seem to be confused.
So I don't think so. I think, if people would feel that India is confused only if they want India to be clearly with one side or the other. I think, as has been articulated by Indian leaders, policymakers repeatedly, that India would like to build the strategic autonomy of its decision making. That on each issue, you take decision based on what you see to be in your interest, not on the interest of A or B country. Now, to be able to do that, you need to build your economic strength further and you need to build your military strength further. And so that's the option. So once you want to exercise strategic autonomy, you must have more than one strong partner. Only then otherwise you'll be bound by the decisions taken by one partner. So I think because of that, sometimes you may be seen as closer to the position of one partner, at other times closer to the position of the other partner. And that may be interpreted by some as confusion. But I think it's essentially trying to preserve space for take decisions as you see based on your political compulsions and national interest.
So going forward into, I mentioned the Quad Summit next month, assuming the Ukraine war continues, and there's every indication it will. Obviously, there's going to be more push on Ukraine. I presume we will continue to shore up our end. But how long do you think we can keep doing this?
So no, I think the Indian government will continue to need to decide as to what is their interest and their positions. And in terms of this particular meeting, if you saw the Indian interlocutors did not appear to be on the defensive. In the virtual meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, the Indian Prime Minister was very upfront in tackling the question of Ukraine. It took a fairly large part of his opening statement, clearly laying out India's position, rationale for India's position. And Foreign Minister Jaishankar also, both in his opening remarks at the 2+2 and at the press statement, clearly laying out what India's position is, the kind of views they have articulated on territorial integrity, sovereignty of countries, need for peace, end to war. So, and the kind of humanitarian assistance that India has been providing. So I think I would say that the Ukraine issue will certainly continue to be in focus. India would need to watch that how is the global opinion shaping up, beyond, of course, the facts on the ground. How is global opinion shaping up in response to the kind of refugee crisis that is developing, in response to the violence and devastation on the ground, large number of people being killed. And the Indian statement, both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister saying clearly that we have condemned the civilian deaths that have happened in Bucha and other places, and India is concerned at that. So India will have to watch how is that global opinion shaping up, and therefore what are the views that India needs to articulate. But at the same time, I think even if we do not seem to agree, as our statements show, with the nature of US action in Ukraine, we will need to preserve the Russia relationship. And that's why clearly the Indian government has not and is unlikely to criticize or condemn Russia specifically for the action that it has taken, because it's an important relationship for India. So I think that would certainly, I'm sure the Indians would be able to manage that. And I think the meeting on 24th May, according to what President Biden said, of the Quad leaders in person in Tokyo, will also be used to focus on the Indo-Pacific, because they need to show that they are not losing the focus on the challenge from China, despite whatever may be happening in Europe. So there will be a need for articulation of responses to what would be seen as China's actions to challenge the rules-based order. And if you saw, even in this 2+2 meeting, Secretary Austin, on several occasions, including in the statement that was put out by the US Department of Defense, spoke about China taking unilateral actions to serve, as they said it, its authoritarian interests, contrary to the rules-based order. So that's something that they need to also deal with and focus on.
So I have another question from Shreyan Sharma. I feel there is a difference between how India sees itself and how the world sees India. There are different expectations.
Look, Shreyans, I would say that it applies to every country. There's a difference between how the US sees itself and how the rest of the world sees the United States. In fact, the US sees itself in many ways as exceptional, and the rest of the world is very often critical of what the US has done, for example, in Afghanistan or Iraq. And today, if you look at it in terms of Russia, President Putin has tremendous support within Russia, although he's being criticized outside, very severely. So there's a big difference between how President Putin and Russia sees, the people of Russia seeing themselves, how the rest of the world. So this is always going to be there. And I think ultimately the people of any country, the leadership of any country, have to make their own assessments as to how they see things in their interest and act on that basis.
So last question, sir. In the joint statement, there was a reference to Afghanistan, the need to ensure that India was not attacked by terror groups, that Afghanistan was not used as a base for terrorism, which is again old hat, really. We don't seem to see any new ideas on Afghanistan.
I think everybody is sort of a bit of a dead end there, because there is a certain fact on the ground, which is that the Taliban are in effective control of Afghanistan. If you remember, soon after the Taliban takeover, the US Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, was speaking at a congressional hearing, and he said the US has faced strategic defeat in Afghanistan. The enemy is in Kabul. So the very people they had driven out in 2001 have now driven them out in 2021. So that's just a fact on the ground. But at the same time, other countries are not recognizing formally the Taliban as a legitimate government, because they still have concerns related to Taliban's continued involvement with various terrorist groups, concerns related to the actions they are taking related to women's rights, girls' education, the kind of repression they are doing in Afghan society. So because of those concerns, although countries are providing humanitarian assistance to deal with the very critical economic and social situation in Afghanistan, they're not really moving forward for legitimizing the Taliban government structure. So that's where things are. But at the same time, there is no force on the ground capable of dislodging the Taliban. So there is a bit of a stalemate, and we'll have to see how things evolve over time.
Ambassador Arun Singh, we're at the end of our time. As always, great perspective and a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Surya. Happy to be with you.
And for all of you out there who came to us with your questions and comments and observations, thank you. Keep sending them in. I look forward to having more questions from you in future conversations. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram. Thank you and good night.